Hi all, I'm Dan Smegrod, founder of the We Get Around Network Forum. Today is Thursday, January 27th, 2022, and you're watching WGAN-TV live at 5. We have an awesome show for you today. Matterport Timeline 2014 to the present, Milestones, Insights, and Commentary. And my guest today, hey Emily, good to see you. Thanks for being on the show again.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, good to be here.
Emily Ullman, founder of Hopscotch Interactive, based in the San Francisco Bay Area. Emily, I reached out to you because you did this awesome video, Matterport Timeline, short video that you published to the Hopscotch Interactive YouTube channel. And I thought it would be great to have you on the show, really to talk about more on the insights and commentary as opposed to what happened on which date. Before we jump into that topic, how about telling us about Hopscotch Interactive?
Absolutely. So Dan, thank you so much for having me here. I am so glad to be on your show today. It's been a while, and I'm also excited that you were interested in learning more about this timeline because I put it together many years ago. This has actually just been refreshed lately, but I created this in, I want to say, maybe 2019 or 2018. It's been a while. But Hopscotch Interactive, since you asked, is a boutique real estate marketing agency, which I started in 2015 for the promotion of extraordinary spaces. And I wanted to do that in 3D and VR. And so I have expanded the agency over the years. We have done, in addition to Matteport, we do real estate photography, we do videography, drone, we do all those real estate services. And we also have been trying to be a thought leader as well in virtual reality and augmented reality. It's a very big passion of mine. I consult for commercial real estate and residential real estate for different marketing departments. And so it's really my passion, and also to see what's on the cutting edge of technology and how I can better serve my clients with the frontier of all this exciting stuff.
Awesome. How did you first learn about Matterport? When did you buy a Matterport camera?
I first learned about Matterport in, I want to say, late 2014. A friend of mine was starting a new company. He was recruiting me to come back from Europe. I was living in Germany for several years, and he had this idea to start a new company. And Matterport was something that he was very interested in using. It was a property management 2.0 company. And Matterport was very exciting because of all of the interesting things that it could do in terms of sort of data collection and video and 360. And so we were interested in it from a property management standpoint, actually, and from landlords. And I was at that company. I tested not just Matterport, but so many different technologies, 360 cameras. And I just loved the Matterport. So when I parted ways with the company in sort of late 2015, we'd already purchased one as a team, and we'd done many scans, and we'd been out in the field using it for months. I needed to, so my mother-in-law was selling a property, and I wanted to use a Matterport. So I did that, and I borrowed it from my friend, and then we used it. The realtor was like, okay, sure, if you want to use that, you can. She wasn't going to stop me. And then basically from that, Hopscotch Interactive was born because the realtor was getting call after call about, how did you do this? And she said to me, do you do this as a service? And I said, well, yeah, sure. So then that was when I returned the camera to my friend, and I bought my own, and I really launched Hopscotch from sort of this like very bootstrapped and very much, let's see what happens, business idea.
Awesome. But let's go back. That was 2015 when Hopscotch Interactive was born, and when you bought your Matterport camera for Hopscotch Interactive. Matterport began before that. When was it really that we know that Matterport kind of started with the camera that we think of today?
Oh, the camera we think of today. I would say, yeah, I mean, I say that it launched in 2014. So that was the Pro 1 camera, and the Pro 2 camera is the next generation of that camera. However, it has the form factor has not changed significantly between the Pro 1 and the Pro 2. However, the software as a service and the Matterport ecosystem, which is what they have always been talking about, is the thing that became more and more in focus as the years went on.
All right, we'll talk about that more later. Let's go back in time. What was kind of significant about 2014, 2015 about Matterport?
Well, for me, and I think for many people, was that it coincided with this total explosion in virtual reality and the interest in VR. Oculus was purchased by Facebook, as you recall. And so when Oculus is purchased by Facebook, that meant that a lot of funding went into the VR, the VR industry. And it was a great time to be a founder back then. And there was a lot of interest in this. And this was just, the very beginning days of Matterport starting to get a little bit of a brand. And for me, what really captured my imagination was being able to use this camera to then create virtual reality content all in one. So a virtual tour, virtual reality content. And that was something that then you could show to people. You could take it around in your purse. You could have a Gear VR, which was a Samsung product, and we could convert spaces into virtual reality and share those with other people. So I demoed Matterport from late 2015, early 2016. I would go to VR meetups. I would demo it. I would share it with people. And I was just super excited about it.
Money.
Yeah.
Of VR at that time.
It cost a lot of money. Yeah. I don't know if people know that, but it cost us $500. $500 per model to convert a space into VR. So I didn't get a lot of people that wanted to pay that much money for it, but
that's on top of whatever Hopscotch Interactive charged. So you had at least a fixed cost of at least $500 per Matterport model converted to virtual reality.
Yes, but I will tell you that one of my very first VR projects, and this may shock some people, but scanning plus VR was $10,000. So I think that number was very exciting to me because I felt like I was offering something nobody else offered. And I wasn't just giving somebody, the same old virtual tour. And so we could charge a premium, and that was great. But again, there's not a lot of people who have just $10,000 laying around for VR when it's not fully rolled out. So much more I could say about that, but
how much more does Matterport charge today for virtual reality?
Oh, so virtual reality is basically free at this point. You just have to have a Quest in order, a VR viewing device in order to view it. Or I believe you can still get access to the showcase. I was looking at the app, it's still on my phone, so I could download the VR Matterport Showcase app, and I could look at models in stereoscopic view with a Google Cardboard. But the best experience is with a Quest. So yeah,
Oculus
it's still
Quest.
Oculus Quest, Oculus Quest 2, Rift. Those are the devices that are the best for viewing now.
So looking at your timeline, actually Matterport didn't officially offer Google Cardboard support until 2017. The virtual reality began as early as 2015.
Yes.
I believe at this point, Matterport has actually sunset Google Cardboard, and really today it's just Oculus Quest or Oculus Go in terms of devices supported.
Yeah, and the Go was also, they stopped producing the Oculus Go, which I had one, but I sold it, at least 2 years ago.
All right, short answer today, if you want to do virtual reality meets Matterport, Oculus, Quest.
Yeah.
I noticed on your timeline that there it says multi-floor features in 2014. Why was that kind of a milestone that you could have multiple floors?
I'm trying to remember, in fact, why that was so significant, but I think that it had to do with the navigation in the showcase. Do you recall exactly what the
Well,
difference
I'll
was?
add a little because I bought my Matterport camera in July of 2014. And at that time, if you wanted to shoot a second floor, you could. It's just that the scan points were on the same level. You couldn't differentiate between one floor and the other on your iPad. So you had to mentally keep track of, oh, you got the first floor. Now these are the scans going up the stairs. Now you're on the second floor, and your mini map looked a mess. So
Wow.
I kind of feel like 2014, 2015 for me was like a ginormous Matterport public beta.
Yeah.
As exciting at the time. We just kind of all rolled with it and accepted. And I do remember trying to shoot a super large space among the first spaces that I tackled, called Matterport when I was having trouble on site. They took my call on a weekend, and we just hadn't thought about doing 50,000 square foot spaces, but we'll figure out how to make that happen for you. So
Absolutely, Dan. And that was what was kind of brilliant about the early days, was that it was definitely an open beta. In fact, we still had it when Matterport would load the preview screen prior to it, it would be a Unity logo. I don't know if you recall that the Unity logo would flash.
vaguely, yeah.
Yeah, so the Unity logo would flash. So they didn't even pay for their Unity license to be white labeled when they first had the app on iOS. And so having done iOS development with my other company, we didn't pay for it either. And I just remembered how funny that was, thinking about that later, going, oh my gosh, they hadn't even paid for that yet.
And probably funny because when I actually bought the Matterport Pro 1 3D camera just after Matterport got funding of $30 million. So I figured, okay, I can build an ecosystem around this with the forum, and I have confidence in spending $4,500 on a camera from a company that's just starting out. I figured, okay, they got deep pockets at least to get going. In fact, we probably even shouldn't dwell too much on 2014, 2015, even 2016, because you and I could reminisce forever about all the things that were happening early on. And there's actually so much exciting stuff that's happened since then and even current. But I do see on your timeline 2016 or so, 2015 Mattertags debut, Matterport statistics, excuse me, starts in 2016. What was significant about Matterport offering outdoor 360s in August of 2016?
Okay, that one was a big deal because prior to that, scanning outdoors, as you know, was a hack, and it still is to this day. If you're not using Cortex, it really depends on how much ultraviolet light is interfering with the infrared in the camera. And so we were not able to suppress the infrared whatsoever. And therefore, we would either have to shoot an exterior scan in the morning hours, in the shade if we were lucky, or after the sun had gone down. So
let me translate a little bit for our viewers that may be new totally to Matterport and trying to understand what we've just said. There is that today Matterport enables you to do 360 scans, 360 views. 360 scans are what we think of perhaps Matterport and 3D models. 360 views are outdoor scans that don't have data attached to the 360, but enable us to shoot a 360 outdoors. And so prior to that, scanning outdoors was really an art, not a science, of having to understand that you could scan as long as the camera couldn't see the sun, sunsets, sunrise, but before the sun could see the camera.
Oh yeah, I showed up once at a cemetery at like 6 or 5:30 or 6 in the morning to scan an outdoor area just in the when before the sun came up. And I was going as long as I could until the sun came up. And then there was just a point where nothing would align anymore. And then it was done. And that was what we did. We just sort of like we hacked it, and we would tell clients we would think it would work, but we couldn't guarantee it. And so having a 360 built into the system for exteriors, because interiors, it was fine, really. You would just scan more or scan to that location. But it was a game changer for the product as an actually useful tour. It was great before, but it wasn't as much of a useful tour if you're missing the entire exterior of the property.
And I don't recall if it was in 2016 or 2015, Matterport introduced Matterport Highlight Reel, which was another feature that seemed to be important as a way to jump from living room to kitchen to bedroom, as opposed to walking through the space if you really wanted to get someplace quickly.
Yeah, hard to imagine that didn't exist at some point, but it didn't. And so, yeah, it's crazy if you're starting now and you think it's just this incredibly robust software and workshop for you to do these tour creation. That wasn't always the case.
In the later part of 2016, Matterport introduces point clouds, access to point clouds. What is that? Why does that matter?
Dan, you're just throwing me a softball. So the point clouds. Okay, well, the point cloud data, and at that time, we should also say there was no paywall associated with the point cloud data. So when the scanner is used to create a model, to create a tour, it basically is what we call time of flight sensor. And so the time of flight sensor is sending out many, many points of light. Those are coming back and being read by the sensor in the camera. And that distance is measured. It creates the geometry of the tour and geometry of the model. That data, the point cloud, this sort of simplified colored point cloud, if you will, is available to people who have access to the files as an XYZ file. Okay, so the XYZ file is a point cloud, meaning it is basically it's sort of the foundational building blocks of the mesh of vertices that then are further simplified to create the dollhouse and what we see. But it's really it's the underlying DNA of a scan, if you want to put it into those terms.
So, I notice on looking up at your Matterport timeline chart, you have two sections. One is Matterport Virtual Tour Company, and the other is Matterport Digital Twin Company.
Yeah.
It seems like that might have been the beginning of actually unlocking the data that moved into Matterport positioning itself as a digital twin company.
I think it was always there, to be honest. I think that the moment that I put on this timeline, so, virtual tour company to digital twin company, that is more about their PR team saying, oh, hey, marketing is saying we need to start using digital twin and maybe now if you ask their marketing team, they would want to say, oh, we're a metaverse company. They may want to change that based on whatever is going to help them with their company and the brand. But yes, I think that all along the value and the underlying value of the scans was never only just the visual elements, but it was the spatial elements.
So I want to say that when Matterport unlocked the point clouds, I don't even know if it was called Matterpak. I guess it wasn't even called a Matterpak at that time. So
no.
At some point in the future, Matterport productizes the point cloud, calls it a Matterpak.
Yeah.
And then starts charging for it.
Yeah, and exactly. So there were a couple of years where it was free for you to get your own data, and they didn't have it. It wasn't called a Matterpak. And then they tried to say, okay, well, you're going to get in the Matterpak. Well, we're going to take away the free one, which is all I needed. I only needed actually it's the OBJ, which is the object file, which can be then imported into Unity, was more relevant to me because I was more interested in using that for virtual reality. But for architects and for design and for digital twin, or people who want to, have a digital twin of a property to use it for other analysis or for IoT, having the point cloud can be valuable. And perhaps, more valuable perhaps, but the point is that, yeah, it was, they did put a paywall up, and then then if all you needed was the OBJ, well, too bad, you have to buy OBJ, you have to buy XYZ and ceiling plan. I've never used a ceiling plan.
Yes. Well, Matterpak may not be the appropriate product or service for you, but who wants to buy a Matterpak, and what do you do with it?
So basically you can use the Matterpak, you can use the different files, like I mentioned, to import that into design software. And so it's really useful for somebody who needs to put it into, I think it was into Autodesk software. If they want to use it in anything for architecture, then for them, it's a huge time saving, because they're able to basically shortcut the part of their workflow where they have to go out and do hand measurements, at least for initial planning.
So if you're an architect and you've been commissioned to redesign a space, instead of maybe going out and taking 1,000 pictures and 1,000 measurements to then reconstruct somebody else's design from many years ago, you could actually engage a Matterport Service Provider, scan the space, order the Matterpak, convert the file either to SketchUp or Revit or AutoCAD, whatever preferred software, and then actually begin designing the space rather than reconstructing someone else's previous space.
Yeah, it's a shortcut. And for architects and for anyone who needs to have, also for, what I liked about Matterport prior, now things seem to be, you can sort of doctor the spaces a little bit more in a way, but those were sort of time stamped in a way because they could not be changed after they were processed unless you added to them and re-uploaded them. And so it was really like a moment in time where you could say, look, this is what it looked like when we started the job. Now we have the reference. We could see what it all looked like. We have, infinite reference images, and we have the data. So it's a huge time saving for anybody who is an architect or doesn't want to revisit a job every time. They just want to know where an outlet is in a room.
Let's move to 2017. I see on your chart, Core VR, iOS, Daydream, Web VR, Matterport Scenes App. Why don't we start with those two? What were they and why were they significant?
Oh my gosh, I want to reach for I have an old Android phone, the Zen Phone AR, in one of my drawers so I could show it to you. Basically, let's start with the Scenes app. So something that we all have now on our devices, right? So we've got our lenses here with LiDAR built into our iPhones, or Core, is it Core VR? You have this AR Core in Android apps or Android phones. And so you're able to basically scan and therefore create that point cloud from your phone, which is very, very cool. And so I can use this now to even make Matterport scans, right? Like my iPhone is a scanning device.
Mm-hmm. But I think of that as 2020 as opposed to 2017.
It's not, though. It was so SLAM technology, which is what this was based on. So this was based on Google Tango. And so there were a few consumer Google Tango devices, which was sort of this dev kit, for Google, for SLAM. And so simultaneous location and mapping, which meant that the cameras, the sensors on the phones, these two phones, it was like there was I think the phone I got, the Zenfone AR, and maybe there was a Lenovo phone.
Yeah, I forget that Google was actually considered, oh, maybe a competitor of data collection using this Google Tango, which I believe came out around even before maybe the Matterport Pro 1 3D camera in 2014.
Yeah, there were
So,
very big devices like clunky dev kit, like bigger dev kits. I think I didn't have one, but a lot of folks that I know in San Francisco had them at their agencies, and they were developing things for those so that they could use them for augmented reality. And
okay.
Matterport Scenes was so cool because it was this early version of what we now have in such a more robust form with AR Kit and AR Core running augmented reality and sort of these the LiDAR scanning happening in our phones.
Let's pause there because this actually comes up a few years from now, and let's put a pin already in the Core VR and the Matterport scenes, because actually there's new technology that Matterport's come out with, and we'll talk about that. I still want to say in 2017, Matterport comes out with the Matterport Pro 2 3D camera. What's different than the Pro 2 versus the Pro 1?
Oh, hold on. Let's go there in a second. But we didn't finish talking about the Daydream and Web VR and Core VR iOS. So the thing I want to say about that before we jump ahead is that Daydream was an all-in-one wearable headset, right? It was untethered. It was not one that needed to be plugged in. And so what that meant is that over the web, you could experience virtual reality content and experience Matterport spaces in an immersive environment without tethering, meaning connection to a PC, right? So that's just, I want to just make sure that we say that at that point. Obviously, Daydream got sunset and it didn't move forward, but that particular—
I'm confused because I mean, someplace in my technology library, my junk room, my wife might say, is a Gear VR, and I could experience a Matterport tour, and that was wireless.
Yes, that's true. That's true. But this, I think, the difference being is that I want to say that I don't remember actually, Dan, it's a good point, but I think that it might have been only through the browser potentially, and not that you had to also have the app. And I would have to look back at that.
I want to say at the time you really had to pay Matterport $500 or more and have the model converted to VR, and it was not browser based. It was, gee, I'm going to use some terms that I don't even understand. Side loaded to my device that let me view a stereoscopic view of Matterport.
More on cardboard, but that was the thing that was cool. Like, so then they changed it. So they stopped doing this whole VR. They launched VR Core, and I think, or Core VR, and I think that's when they stopped. They said no more $500. Yes. They said now it's free for everybody. Every space will have a little goggle, and you can just navigate from that goggle to either your cardboard or to, if you have a Daydream, you can do it in Daydream.
Yes, probably a good decision in terms of reaching the masses, though. The version of virtual reality actually changed, because I want to say in the early version of Matterport virtual reality, I want to say you really felt like you were totally immersed.
Well, those were hand blended. So they were basically taking your tour. That's why it costs $500, is because they were hand blending the tour to make it feel immersive, like you were really moving. And what they switched to with the free version, hoping to have more people use it, was the pano to pano, where you look and you see a blue dot, and then you navigate to the blue dot. And you have to, it's gaze activated VR, right? So the gaze and holding your head in a particular location activates the virtual reality experience.
Yeah, I suspect that was a better decision because it reached more people. And for some, even my wife, I think in the early days where I tried to have her look in virtual reality, she did it once and said, I can't do this. It just, makes her nuts. Where perhaps you and I were like, oh, this is the most exciting thing I could ever imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I put it on the head of a quadriplegic, and with just his eyeballs and looking around and moving his head, he was able to go and move around a house, move upstairs. And, when he was asked by the conference organizer, like, what was the best thing you saw? He said it was that experience. And so, I had really cool connections with people over creating that content that I felt like was enabling, accessibility. Like, ironically, VR is sometimes seen as something that's inaccessible, but this was actually bringing accessibility to people. So yeah, it was a good decision.
Do you think Matterport VR would be now accessible, even in its different flavor today?
Oh, with the Quest. Yeah, that's a good question. I would say I don't know. I don't really know the answer to that.
It's interesting because if you said, well, we're going to do it for the masses and we're going to, make it so it doesn't cost anything, but I wonder what happened that Google Cardboard didn't get supported, because that would have been the least expensive VR device to help people get on the on-ramp for virtual reality.
No, absolutely. And like I was saying, like, I still have the Matterport app in my phone. And so, it's all messed up. Like, it hasn't been updated in a million years. So this is definitely wonky, and it probably is obsolete at this point, but it'll only get better. So that's the stuff we get to talk about sort of in the now.
Okay. And we'll do that. I do want to touch on the Matterport Pro 2 3D camera introduced in the latter part of 2017 based on your timeline. How does the Matterport Pro 2 compare to the Matterport Pro 1 camera?
So the biggest differences for me it was the fidelity. Everything else more or less stayed the same, but the image quality increased significantly, such that they were saying that it was 4K imagery, arguably, with their panoramas, which I think was great. Like, the fidelity had been so low that it didn't hold up to even some of the better 360 cameras that were coming out at the time, sort of all-in-one devices. Probably the Theta, I would say at that time, maybe the Theta S. I don't think that the Theta V was out yet. But they were getting there. They were approaching they were kind of the same. And so then when the Matterport Pro 2 came out, it was a big leap in fidelity. And
what about in terms of speed? Pro 2 being faster than the Pro 1?
Yeah, no, not initially. I don't remember when I should have put fast capture on here. Do you remember when fast capture was updated?
No. So, but I want to say that was a firmware update that ran the camera.
Yeah.
Excuse me, that it could spin faster, and therefore it doesn't sound like a big deal that you could save 5 or 10 or 15 seconds, but it turns out if you're doing 200 scans in a day, it's a big deal.
Oh yeah. It's mega. It's a huge difference. And, and I remember doing speed tests where it was like 45. Well, it would depend. Like, it's part camera. The camera can spin fast, but how fast does your processing device work? So, like, I always had these iPad minis in the beginning because they had the most storage. And that was always the biggest thing. It was like the least amount of money for the same amount of storage, but the processors might not have been as powerful. And so they would take a little longer to align. And fast capture was a big deal. And the other thing that's very notable about the Pro 2 was the GPS. And so it was sort of like, it was interesting because up until GPS was put into the camera, the only way Matterport would know that as far as I know, that there was any connection between your property that you scanned and the location of that property was based on whether you entered an address. So for privacy, for any reason, and the 400,000 scans that had been captured up until that point, it was not millions, it was about 400,000. The 400,000 scans that had been captured up until that point were not necessarily connected to any geolocation. And when the GPS was put into the camera, we were also not given the option to suppress that. So I was critical of it for various reasons, one of which I think was privacy.
I think for us, maybe who were early fans of Matterport, they did some things, unfortunately, that were opting us in automatically instead of giving us a chance to opt in. We were automatically opt in to stuff. And things that we might assume for common sense purposes from privacy, security, and user choice, that's a whole nother show.
That's a whole other show. But I think that that change was justified by them saying that for placing 360s outside, and that it would sort of assist in alignment. I don't know if that's actually accurate, but that's what we were told.
At the same time, you can move a 360 view manually either on your iPad or in Matterport Workshop. But okay, in 2018, shortly after the Pro 2 comes out, according to the Hopscotch Interactive Matterport timeline, Matterport pairs with the Leica BLK 360. What is a Leica BLK 360, and why did it matter that you could use a BLK 360 to create a Matterport scan?
So a Leica BLK 360 is a sort of, I would say, like a sister brother device. It's a device that that Leica manufactures. It is a LiDAR, I believe, and LiDAR camera. And the thing is that it is a long range one. So it's highly accurate over long distances. And so it's used most effectively in large areas where you need to capture a lot of space. For example, like they did a demo at the Lawrence Livermore Science Lab at Berkeley, really close to us. And so they captured this huge dome. I think that's one of the ones that they first debuted, showing us, look, we can capture all the way to the ceiling. Because remember, the ceiling oftentimes get left out.
So with a Matterport Pro 2, I would say you maybe do 2.5, 3 stories inside a gymnasium. You'd probably lose the ceiling. The ceiling would be a gym. The ceiling would be too high.
Yeah,
Use it like a BLK 360. You can actually get the scan data, the data points of the ceiling.
Or you could scan outside. You're not going to have the same interference as you have with the infrared camera. And so it is useful for sort of as like a companion to the Matterport, because you can run it with the Matterport capture software, and it's like switching between a Matterport Pro 2 or switching between another device.
Okay, so I heard be able to scan outdoors, scan data, be able to do high ceilings or greater distance, so covered larger areas. I would probably add accuracy of the scan data versus the Matterport Pro 2. And then, of course, the trade-off is probably $19,000 for a Leica BLK 360. And it takes longer to actually do BLK 360 scans. So you really have to, you're not really going to just substitute that to do a house, because it would take far longer than it would to do a Pro 2, and it's probably overkill. And I'm going to ask you the question about overkill residential Matterport data.
Oh yeah,
I'm going to get there, because I know you mentioned that in your Hopscotch Interactive YouTube channel video. I noticed on your timeline, there's a Matterport in 2018, a Matterport Pro 2 Lite camera.
Yeah.
What was that? Why did that matter, if at all?
So two things with that one. One was that it was a shorter battery life. And so they brought down the price to about $2,400. And that they were hoping would help people that needed to use it, just like an occasional realtor might pick one up and have one around. And I believe also that the Pro 2 Lite, you could do a sort of pay-as-you-go model on the hosting and the processing. And I didn't have one, but I know people who had them. And yeah, I was not a big fan of it.
We won't spend too much time on it. We're Matterport service providers. We're planning to scan all day. We need a Matterport Pro 2 camera that can scan for 8 to 10 hours on a charge without a problem. The Pro 2, as you said, really designed for maybe a real estate agent just doing one property. One battery in the camera instead of 2, that was plenty. At the time, it was a play by Matterport to try and have a lower price point to have something for real estate agents. Just kind of fast forward today, if you have a Matterport Pro 2 Lite, you're now on new pricing, and it's the same as a Matterport Pro 2 3D camera. And if you want to get a second battery put in, we Get Around Network Forum member, Matterfix,
Oh, yeah, those guys.
Matterfix.io can put a second battery in it, and it's now became a Matterport Pro 2.
That's cool. That's cool that
Three.
they can do that. Those guys seem to be really able to do some quite, technical wizardry with their hardware updates and their fixes.
2018 is also the introduction of Google Street View, Matterport to Google Street View. What was that? Why did that matter, or does it matter?
Yeah, it was cool because it basically was enabling us to publish right from Workshop from a Matterport scan into Google Street View. And it was, again, the same thing where they started out offering it as a beta free for us. And then later they put a paywall up, I think $14.99 for a scan. Matterport uploads to Google Street View are also very messy. The constellation, meaning, the navigation, which is why they purchased virtual walkthrough. I think that's one of the reasons they purchased virtual walkthrough around this time, was the technical team that had really solved for a very elegant constellation. And so, which is the navigation points, the waypoints for Google Street View, or those types of panoramic tours. But yeah, Google Street View was something that we could then do as service providers. It was another thing for us to offer to our clients. I don't find a huge amount of overlap between my clients and Google Street View clients.
So if you're doing residential, it doesn't matter at all. If you're doing commercial spaces and the client wants to be on Google Maps, then without any special expertise, a Matterport service provider can scan with a Matterport Pro 2 camera and in Matterport Workshop publish to Google Street View. But I think, as you said, sometimes the walking experience is not always perfect. And so you can actually use a tool like PanoSkin Pro to export all the 360s from Google Street View, import them into PanoSkin Pro 2, tweak that constellation, that walking around experience, and then publish it back to Google Maps. So that's a little bit geeky. It might be off the path. I know I want to try and get you out of here. I know you got a scan coming up, so we're going to actually move on.
But exactly. I don't even have it on my website anymore, Dan, because I felt like, it's every Matterport service provider can do it, but it's not a core piece of my business.
Okay. 2018, January 2018, Matterport announces its SDK is open. What is that? What is an SDK? Why does that matter? What does that enable?
Yeah, so the SDK is basically like, let's see, there's a couple of different definitions for that. It's either software developer kit, or it's basically, depending on who's telling you what they think it is, it means that they're opening up their software, opening up the Matterport software for third-party developers to develop on their platform. And
why does that matter?
It matters because Matterport had a lot of feature requests, and they see themselves as a company that, was building this tool, but not necessarily as a developer of all of the infinite things people might want to do with a space. And so by opening that up to a developer ecosystem, it meant, Dan, that anybody could then come to Matterport. In the beginning, you had to sign up to be sort of a qualified software developer. So that meant that not everybody could get into it right away, and they were really only doing it with qualified developers. But yeah, it's just so that anybody can build on top of the platform and use the Matterport data sort of as their base for creating other experiences.
So that was 2018. I want to say that was kind of a public-private beta use of the Matterport API SDK kits. I think if we just fast forward to 2020, I want to say 2022, in 2021, Matterport actually kind of re-announced the API SDKs in their partner program. And I'm going to say there's at least 100, if not 150 Matterport partners that are creating solutions based on the Matterport API and the various SDKs,
Yeah.
Some of which are actually public.
Yeah, Exactly. And this is the stuff where, and I think the We Get Around network is a great forum for this stuff, because how are you going to keep track of all of the people that are developing, of all of the different things? And you have such a repository of both historical information, and then also these different developers, are in touch with you, and then they're sharing what they're doing. And I think, we, and even me, on YouTube, if I can, when I have time, I like to share the things people are doing, because I think it's super exciting. And that's where, yeah, they re-announced it, or they made it a bigger focal point, and that's very smart. They needed to do that.
So maybe we'll just do analogy and move forward. I have my iPhone. You held up your iPhone. It's kind of like the App Store. It's like the iPhone is great, but it's incredibly great because of all the different things you can do with it, because of the developers that are building out tools and solutions using the iOS platform. I imagine Matterport would hope that the same happens.
Yeah.
Cortex comes out in 2019. What is Matterport Cortex, and why does that matter?
So Matterport Cortex is this very cool computational sort of artificial intelligence photogrammetry. I know those are very jargony words, but it is, Cortex is this ability for you to take a 360 pano and then to reposition that on the map, and then to convert that into a 3D scan. Like, it will basically map to the geometry of the space. It works most of the time to do that, not all of the time. And so it helped us overcome things like, sunlight and scanning outside, or even being able to scan with a camera that has no built-in geometry or a time of flight sensor whatsoever, such as a Ricoh Theta V or an Insta 360.
Well, let's talk about that, because in 2019, Matterport announces partnerships with Ricoh, with the Ricoh Theta. Actually, I want to say the Ricoh Theta S, the Ricoh Theta SC2, maybe the Ricoh V.
Yeah, those are the ones. Yeah, I don't know about S, but SC2V for sure, and Z1 are then all.
Which then subsequently came. I don't believe Z1 was out at the time that they did the announcement.
Yeah.
And in a similar fashion, Matterport announces a partnership, an integration with Insta 360.
Yeah.
So today I would say it's the Insta 360 One X2, the Insta 360 One. R.
Oh, the R, yeah, the R. That's right.
So, but when it first announced, I want to say it was with an Insta 360 One.
Yeah, so, and those are cameras that you could buy for not $3,500, but for maybe $350, and then you could make the spaces. And this is where I think we have also philosophical divergence between what is a professional space, and what's the true value of this space if the underlying data is a little messy and it's a little bit less clean, and is it still valuable to us in the same way, and is the Pro 2 now overkill?
So the introduction of the Insta 360 and the Ricoh Theta paired with Matterport, and now having the underlying Cortex, that sounds like, well, that was interesting, because it enabled a 360 camera to sort of kind of do what a Matterport Pro 2 does, but at a price point from $350, as you mentioned, to maybe $1,000 instead of $3,500. I think the philosophical question is probably for yet a different show.
I think that's a good topic, though, because let me tell you, it came up this week. But yeah.
How did it come up?
It came up because a property where two teams needed to be at the same time, and one was a video team and one was a photo team. And the video team was like, no, just do it with the Z1. And I was like, no, but I really want to do it with the Pro 2. And so you know, we all know that you can do this. And I even did a video on YouTube called Matterport versus Matterport. Can you tell the difference? And it's this question of, you know, how do you scale? How do you get faster? If you have to do 5 Matterport shoots in a day, it's a lot faster, and realtors may not care. Whereas if you need the data for accurate floor plans, it's going to be worth spending the extra time to potentially use Matterport or a different floor plan solution. But certainly there are arguments for both.
Interesting in the We Get Around Network forum, WGAN-forum.com today, Thursday, January 27th, 2022, a new member just posted this exact question. No, actually an older member said, I have a Matterport Pro 2 3D camera. I'm looking at an Insta360 1X2. What's the difference and how do I make a decision? So I guess that part of it is price for hardware, and second is speed, and third maybe is quality. Does that sound?
Yeah, and I think also error. I think that the using a device like the Pro 2, which actually has that data and can isn't going just on the photo, is going to have a better alignment. I just trust it more personally.
So let's talk about quality in 2 ways. One is in terms of 360 imagery, and the other is in terms of 3D data.
Right.
So how does the image quality compare with maybe an Insta360 1X2, or you're using a Ricoh Theta Z1? How does the Z1 compare to the Pro 2? And I think you've already answered the question. You would rather use a Pro 2 for quality, but your team was asking you to use the Ricoh Theta Z1 because you could actually do the tour faster.
A different crew was asking me to do that, or they were saying, did I know about it? And I said, of course I knew about it. And you know, but that I wasn't really a big fan of it. However, the video that I did where I did the test and I tried it, I mean, everybody can see the difference. I mean, everybody can see the difference between the one scan with the Pro 2 if they know what
except the real estate agents. So you know what to look for, but most real estate agents, unless you told them and said, this is the difference between this and this, you probably wouldn't know. You would know, I would know, our community would know. In terms of the data, were you doing a space where the data mattered?
To me, to build floor plans. Yeah.
Floor plans. So you actually wanted to have accurate data where you would say the Matterport Pro 2 would beat the accuracy of the 360 cameras in terms of accuracy to create floor plans without having to maybe do laser measurements on top of everything else. If you're using a Ricoh Theta Z1 in order to, I don't know what the word would be, normalize, to calibrate the floor plan to the correct size.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so that's kind of 2019. 2020, Cortex on the iPhone. I'm looking at TruePlan for Xactimate. What is a TruePlan for Xactimate?
So TruePlan for Xactimate is basically it's something you can buy through Matterport. I was in the beta program for that too. However, I never got anybody to purchase one. So I think it's really for crews that are construction companies or renovation teams or architects who have an in-house need to have a level of detail, the LOD, be higher. And so it was basically doing an enhanced floor plan that includes more information and is also a lot more expensive.
So, and I would say, since my wife and I have been lucky enough to be through 3 floods in our house on different occasions, and adjusters come out, that's what they do. They work with Xactimate in order to do the claim documentation for flood, fire, etc. And that's what needs to be submitted to an insurance company, and they work in Xactimate. And so maybe you can use a Matterport to have the Xactimate created for you. That's actually a whole nother show. We've done at least 2 shows on this topic of
Cool.
WGAN. So if you're interested, just Google either TruePlan or Xactimate and Matterport, either in the We Get Around Network forum, WGANforum.com, or just Google it, and you should probably still come up with WGAN-TV, Xactimate, TruePlan, insurance claim documentation. Kind of in the 2001 time, a lot of interesting things happened in terms of Android capture only on iPhone, capture only with an Android device. Do you want to just take that whole topic as one?
Yeah, I could just cover it briefly because I don't think it's that much to explain. It's just that we had been really in the iOS ecosystem. We had to pair with an iOS device, whether that was an iPad or that was an iPhone. And with the Pro 2 scanning, those models can get pretty big and pretty large, the larger the scan gets. So, data, having a high capacity, high processing, best of the line iPad is going to cost you a lot more money, and having an equivalent Android device is not. And so I think it was opening up us to be able to scan, and we could scan on our phones, we could use an Android device or an iOS device. And something that I think was already possible when they moved to Android capture, it was because of the Android operating system. That meant that backup and moving of models was already a lot easier, because I was still on iOS and I had struggled forever on capture, on backup and transfer of models. My team doesn't all live in the same city. But sometimes we want to finish a job for somebody else. And so we have had, to this day, we've had challenges with that if we didn't have the ability to transfer models. So this whole thing of Android, I think, opened up the world, to Matterport in a different way. And it also made life easier for us to just share our data with other people if we needed to.
So I'm going to maybe summarize some timeline elements, and I'm going to ask you to comment again on significance. You can now use an iPhone, an iOS only device to do Matterport capture. Doesn't have to be paired with a Matterport Pro 2 or a 360 camera. You just can handheld use an iPhone or use an Android. Does that matter?
Oh, I've not tested Android. I don't use Android personally, so yes. I don't know the answer to that, but I believe you can do that with both.
You can. And so I'll just give you my short piece on it, is to say, just because you can doesn't mean that you have a commercial solution. I know, excuse me, it's kind of beyond your timeline, because your timeline is really features and such with Matterport, not things like, well, how many people sign up for a Matterport cloud account? And I think the interesting thing is the cloud accounts for Matterport have skyrocketed, but it's because there's a free account and you can use a handheld iPhone only or handheld Android only to capture space. But after you do one scan, this is not really a solution for business. So you really need to go buy a camera. So I just kind of view it as a novelty. I'll put a footnote on that, as I'll say, I'll change my mind tomorrow when Matterport comes out with a commercial grade rotator that pairs with a smartphone to create 360s. And now I think that kind of leads into the LiDAR that's built into our iOS devices now.
That's right. And I think that companies that are close, Dan, would be the Pivo, for example. If Pivo, do you know what I'm talking about?
The Pivo for real estate. In the We Get Around Network forum, if you just Google Pivo real estate, is 3 words, you'll pop up a video that Emily has produced on this topic. I think at least one.
At least one, yeah.
And there's a lot of content in the We Get Around Network forum on the Pivo real estate platform that uses a Pivo Pod Black specifically. That's the brand, Pod Black, for creating virtual tours.
Yeah, exactly. That's this guy, right? Let's see if you can see it. Right. So this guy is
a rotator.
A rotator.
But surprisingly, that Matterport does not have a rotator to create scans for Matterport.
Right? So, you would think. It's so cool. And I mean, it needs to be calibrated, and it's not calibrated even for Zillow, but it's close, and it's a much better, more useful solution than holding it with your hand and shaking.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So Matterport comes out recently with notes collaboration. What is that? Why does that matter?
So notes and collaboration. So my take on why this is important is that when we talk about Matterport as a digital twin company and we look at the things that it's heading into now, it's using the model for more than just its virtual tour use case. And it's saying, actually, no, there's a perennial use case for this model because we can use it to communicate with our team, and we can mark up spaces, and we can share, and we can annotate, and it can be useful as a communication device, or communication, I guess a location that we can join in together. And so it always was with Matter tags, but this is more robust. And this is where I think Matterport's doing a few things in-house, but once you see the explosion of API, SDK partners with Matterport doing very cool things, you'll see stuff like way beyond what we can even imagine with notes.
My second to last question, in your video about the Matterport timeline that you created, you talk about overkill for residential. Can you tell us about that, and what does that mean?
What I meant with that was that that sometimes the Matterport as a virtual tour solution is not necessarily necessary with, for example, a Pro 2 camera, because it's so much data and it's so rich with all the things that it can do, but we only use 10% of it in the virtual tour, and the rest of it's sort of lost and thrown out, and actually very disinteresting for the realtor. And so that's why I think that other virtual tours that just, if a client just needs a virtual tour, they don't need to be asking for Matterport, but yet they do. And so it's, but people are saying, but I don't like the dollhouse. It makes me dizzy. There's all this stuff. So, and that's why I would say, Matterport had become very much the standard over the pandemic, and over the last several years. But I think that, the dollhouse and the 3D data that we get is ultimately more valuable for Matterport than it really is for the realtor or for the seller, unless they're going to use it for notes or to go to Home Depot and to show their house to, somebody. And you have to really think, what are the use cases for the underlying data? And is that of value to me? And am I paying for something more than I need to if I'm getting a 3D scan when I don't really need all of that?
Last question. Is there something that we didn't talk about the timeline today that we should really talk about?
Ooh, well, I think that we talked about capture, we talked about being able to download spaces briefly. I think that's huge. That came out this just in January, that we have this ability to do that. And yeah, I think that what we didn't talk about, Dan, are where is it going to go from here? I think that the timeline is evolving, and I am excited to see what ends up on the timeline next. So, Matterport Digital Twin Company, Matterport Metaverse Company. I want to know kind of, what those next moves will be. And I think we'll probably have to connect again on another talk and at another time. But those are the things that I would be curious about, to see what flag gets planted on this timeline next.
That's awesome. We should do that, because I think what's more interesting is to take the timeline from today forward and imagine what it either could be or should be and why. And I suspect that we both probably have a lot of opinions on that topic. Emily, I know we could be talking forever on this timeline and doing a deep dive. I'm so grateful that I know you're running out to actually do a scan today. So thank you for being on the show again.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you. And if anybody wants to reach out, they should connect with me at my website, or connect with me on the We Get Around Network forum.
So on your website is hopscotchinteractive.com, in the We Get Around Network forum at Hopscotch. And we've been visiting with Emily Ullman. Emily is the founder of Hopscotch Interactive, based in the greater San Francisco Bay Area. Super happy to have Emily on the show, taking us through the Matterport timeline that she's created. For Emily in the San Francisco Bay Area, I'm Dan Smigrod, founder of the We Get Around Network Forum, and you've been watching WGAN-TV.